Deep in the Colorado Rockies, an 18-year-old woman named Emma had spent her entire life believing she was nobody's daughter, nobody's family, just another forgotten face at St. Catherine's Orphanage. She had learned to survive on her own, to expect nothing from a world that had given her nothing. But when a letter arrived summoning her to the bedside of a dying farmer she'd never heard of, everything she thought she knew shattered. The old man, weathered and frail, looked at her with eyes full of recognition and whispered words that made no sense. "You're my only heir. The land is yours now." She had no memory of him, no connection to his remote mountain farm. So why did he choose her? What secret had he protected for 18 years? And what was buried on that isolated property that someone would kill to keep hidden? The morning Emma turned 18, the world didn't transform the way the younger children at St. Catherine's Orphanage always whispered it would. She woke in the same narrow bed she'd slept in for the past 12 years, in the same dormitory room with its peeling paint and the perpetual smell of industrial cleaner and old wood. Through the window, Denver sprawled below in the weak light of early spring, a city of strangers where she would soon have to make her way alone. She was a slender young woman with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and cautious hazel eyes that had learned long ago not to hope for much. Her belongings fit into a single duffel bag sitting at the foot of her bed. 3 changes of clothes, a few books, and the small wooden box that held the only photograph she'd ever been given, a faded picture of a woman she'd been told was her mother, though no name or story came with it. The orphanage had been her entire world, a place of routine and rules where she'd learned to keep her head down, to be useful, to expect nothing. Sister Margaret, the stern but fair administrator, had helped her secure a job at a downtown diner and a tiny studio apartment she could barely afford, and in 2 days Emma would walk out of St. Catherine's doors for the last time, with nowhere to return to if she failed. She was in the common room that afternoon, sorting through donation boxes to find a winter coat that might last her another season, when Sister Margaret appeared in the doorway, holding a cream-colored envelope with an expression Emma couldn't quite read. The envelope was thick, official, with a return address from a law office in a town called Pinewood Ridge that Emma had never heard of. Sister Margaret handed it to her without a word, and Emma's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them good because good things didn't arrive in official envelopes for girls like her. The letter inside was typed on expensive paper, the kind that felt substantial between her fingers, and the words swam before her eyes as she tried to make sense of them. It was from an attorney named Howard Breslin, requesting her immediate presence at Rocky Mountain Regional Hospital in Pinewood Ridge, where a man named Samuel Hartwell lay dying and had specifically asked for her. The letter stated that Mr. Hartwell claimed she was his sole heir, and that time was of the essence as his condition was rapidly deteriorating. Emma read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper into her confusion. She had no family, had never had family, had spent 18 years being nobody's daughter, nobody's granddaughter, nobody's anything. The name Samuel Hartwell meant nothing to her, stirred no memory, no recognition. Yet according to this attorney, a dying stranger in the mountains knew exactly who she was and wanted to leave her something. Sister Margaret watched her face carefully and finally spoke, her voice softer than usual. "I've verified the law office is legitimate," she said. "I called them myself. Whatever this is, Emma, it's real. The question is whether you're going to go." Emma looked at the letter again, at the address of a hospital nearly 3 hours away in a part of Colorado she'd never seen, and felt the first stirring of something she'd taught herself never to feel. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. It was possibility. For the first time in her life, someone had sent for her specifically, had asked for her by name, and whether this Samuel Hartwell was a stranger or something more, He had answers to questions Emma had carried her entire life. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and looked up at Sister Margaret with a determination that surprised them both. "I'm going," she said, and the words felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff into open air. The drive into the mountains was a journey into another world, the flat urban sprawl of Denver giving way to foothills that rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the arrival of spring. Emma had borrowed Sister Margaret's old sedan, promising to return it within 2 days, and she drove with white knuckles, gripping the steering wheel as the highway climbed higher, and the air grew thinner. Pinewood Ridge was barely a town, just a handful of buildings clustered around a single intersection with a general store, a post office, and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. The hospital was small and old, a 2-story brick building that served the scattered rural communities of the high country, and Emma felt her heart hammering as she walked through its doors and approached the nurse's station. The nurse, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, seemed to be expecting her, and led her down a quiet corridor where the smell of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of sickness and approaching death. Room 114 was at the end of the hall, and the nurse paused at the door, her hand on the handle, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she said that Mr. Hartwell had been asking for Emma by name every hour, that he'd been holding on for days longer than anyone expected, that it was only his will to see her that kept him breathing. Emma stepped inside, and the first thing she saw was the man in the bed, so frail and wasted by illness that he seemed more ghost than flesh, his skin the color of old parchment stretched over prominent bones, his breathing a labored rasp that filled the small room. But when his eyes opened and found her standing in the doorway, something extraordinary happened. Recognition blazed in those faded blue eyes, immediate and absolute, and his cracked lips formed a single word that she couldn't quite hear. She moved closer, pulled by something she didn't understand, and sat in the chair beside his bed as his skeletal hand reached for hers with surprising strength. "Emma," he whispered, his voice like wind through dead leaves. "You have her eyes, your grandmother's eyes. I knew you'd come." She wanted to ask him who he was, how he knew her, why he'd summoned her from a life he shouldn't have known existed, but before she could speak, his grip tightened with desperate urgency. From beneath his pillow, he pulled out an old brass key on a leather cord and pressed it into her palm, his fingers closing hers around it. "The farm," he gasped, each word a battle. "It's yours now, all of it. The land, the house, everything." His breathing grew more labored, his eyes losing focus, but he fought to stay present. "They poisoned it, Emma. The land, the water. They killed it all, and they killed me for knowing. Don't let them bury the truth with me. Promise me." She felt tears on her cheeks, though she didn't remember starting to cry. "I don't understand. Who are you? Who poisoned what?" But Samuel Hartwell's eyes were already glazing over, his grip loosening, and with his final breath he whispered 2 more words that would change everything. "I'm sorry." Then he was gone, and Emma sat holding the hand of a dead stranger who'd known her name, clutching a key to a life she'd never imagined, and carrying the weight of a dying man's last desperate plea for justice. The reading of the will took place 2 days later in Howard Breslin's law office, a cramped space above the general store in Pinewood Ridge that smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. Emma sat in a wooden chair that creaked under her slight weight, still numb from the surreal experience of watching a stranger die while claiming connection to her, still clutching the brass key he'd pressed into her palm like it was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to smoke. Breslin was a man in his late 60s with nervous hands that constantly shuffled papers, and he avoided making direct eye contact as he read through the formal legal language of Samuel Hartwell's last will and testament. The words washed over Emma in a tide of disbelief. She was now the sole owner of 240 acres of mountain property in the high country west of Pinewood Ridge, including a farmhouse, a barn, all structures and improvements, all personal possessions, and a small bank account containing $8,000. Breslin's voice wavered as he read, and Emma noticed the way his eyes kept darting to the office door, as if he expected someone to burst through it at any moment. The tension in the room was a living thing, and Emma was about to ask what was wrong when there was a sharp knock, and the door opened without invitation. The man who entered was everything the mountain town was not: polished, expensive, urban. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Emma had seen in her entire life, and his smile was the practiced expression of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. He introduced himself as Richard Vance, Senior Acquisitions Officer for Apex Mining Corporation, and he settled into the chair beside Emma with the casual entitlement of ownership. "Miss Hartwell," he began, and Emma flinched at the surname she'd never carried. "I want to offer my condolences for your loss, and also present you with an opportunity. Apex Mining has been interested in properties in this region for some time, and we're prepared to make you a very generous offer for the land you've just inherited. $75,000, cash, with closing completed within a week. For a young woman in your position, this would provide substantial security." He said it smoothly, reasonably, but Emma caught the subtle emphasis on your position, the unspoken reminder that she was an orphan with nothing, that she should be grateful for whatever crumbs fell from the corporate table. Breslin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Emma saw something in his expression that looked like warning, or perhaps fear. She thought about Samuel's last words, about poison and truth and burial, and she looked at Richard Vance's confident smile and felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. "No," she said simply, and watched his smile falter. "I haven't even seen the property yet. I'm not selling anything until I understand what I've inherited." Vance's expression hardened, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal something cold beneath. "Miss Hartwell, I don't think you understand. That land is worthless for farming or development. It's isolated, the soil is poor, and frankly, maintaining it will drain whatever resources you have. We're offering you a way out." Emma stood, the brass key heavy in her pocket, Samuel's dying plea echoing in her mind. "Then you won't mind waiting until I've seen this worthless land for myself," she said, and walked out of the office, leaving Richard Vance staring after her with an expression that was no longer friendly at all. The directions Breslin had reluctantly provided led Emma up a narrow dirt road that climbed steadily into the high country, the pavement giving way to gravel, and then to little more than 2 rutted tracks carved through dense pine forest. The borrowed sedan protested every jarring bump and washout, and twice Emma had to stop to move fallen branches that blocked the path, evidence that this route saw little traffic and less maintenance. The air grew thinner and colder as she climbed, and through breaks in the trees she caught glimpses of snow-capped peaks that seemed close enough to touch, their majesty both breathtaking and isolating. After nearly an hour of climbing, the forest opened suddenly into a high mountain valley, and Emma's breath caught in her throat at the unexpected beauty of it. The farmhouse sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and aspens, whose new leaves trembled silver green in the mountain breeze, a sturdy log structure with a covered porch, and a stone chimney that rose against the brilliant blue sky. Beyond it, a weathered barn leaned slightly to one side, and beyond that, the land rolled gently toward a tree line that marked the edge of national forest. A creek, crystal clear and fast-moving with snowmelt, cut through the property, its cheerful burbling the only sound in the profound mountain silence. Emma parked the sedan and stepped out, and the air that filled her lungs was so clean and sharp it almost hurt, scented with pine and fresh water and earth. This was her inheritance, this place of rugged beauty that Samuel Hartwell had fought to protect with his dying breath, and standing in the clearing with the sun warm on her face and the mountains rising all around, Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she couldn't quite name. She approached the farmhouse with the brass key clutched in her hand, mounted the 3 wooden steps to the porch, and unlocked the heavy front door. It swung open on well-oiled hinges, and she stepped into a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a sleeping loft visible above. Everything was neat, preserved, as if Samuel had simply stepped out for a walk and would return at any moment. His coffee mug sat on the table, his reading glasses folded beside a book, his coat hung on a peg by the door. Emma moved through the space, slowly, reverently, touching the rough-hewn furniture, the cast-iron stove, the simple curtains on the windows. And then she saw it, hanging on the wall above the fireplace, in a simple wooden frame. A photograph of a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair falling past her shoulders, and hazel eyes that looked out from the faded image, with a cautious hope that Emma recognized, because she saw it every time she looked in a mirror. The resemblance was not subtle or coincidental. It was absolute, undeniable, the face of someone who could have been Emma's twin, separated by decades. Her hands trembled as she lifted the frame from its hook, and on the back, in faded ink, she found a single word written in careful script. Sarah. Emma sank into the chair by the cold fireplace, the photograph clutched to her chest, and finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been building since. Samuel's deathbed. Who was she, really? And what connection bound her to this dying farmer and this isolated mountain farm? Emma was examining the photograph, trying to understand the impossible resemblance between herself and the woman named Sarah. When she heard it, a low, mournful howl that came from somewhere behind the house, a sound of such profound grief that it raised goosebumps on her arms. She set the frame down carefully and moved to the back door, stepping out onto a smaller porch that overlooked a fenced yard and the barn beyond. That's when she saw him, a large German shepherd with a distinctive coat of russet brown and cream white, lying beneath a sprawling pine tree, with his head resting on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on the house, with an expression of heartbreaking expectation. The dog raised his head as Emma appeared, his ears pricking forward, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the distance, 2 creatures both trying to understand their sudden loss. Emma descended the porch steps slowly, speaking in a soft, gentle voice, telling him she meant no harm, but the dog rose to his feet and backed away, maintaining the distance between them. He wasn't aggressive, showed no teeth, issued no warning growl, but his wariness was absolute, and Emma realized he was waiting for someone who would never come home. She was trying to decide how to approach him when she heard the sound of a vehicle coming up the road, and moments later an old pickup truck pulled into the clearing. The woman who climbed out was perhaps 70, small and sturdy, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a braid, and a face weathered by decades of mountain sun. She carried a large bag of dog food over one shoulder, with surprising ease, and when she saw Emma, her expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like recognition. "You must be Emma," she said, setting the bag down and approaching with an outstretched hand. "I'm Helen Drummond. I live about 3 miles down the valley. Closest neighbor Samuel had. I've been coming up to feed Ranger since Samuel went into the hospital. Poor boy's been lost without him." At the sound of his name, and Helen's familiar voice, the dog's tail gave a tentative wag, and he trotted over to her, pressing his head against her leg while keeping his eyes on Emma. Helen scratched behind his ears with obvious affection and continued, her voice dropping lower. "I'm glad you came, and I'm glad you're staying. At least for now. Someone needs to be here." Emma caught the emphasis on her words and asked what she meant. Helen's expression grew serious, her eyes scanning the tree line as if checking for watchers. "Strange things have been happening on this property for months now. Equipment going missing, fences cut, Samuel's truck vandalized. He reported it to the sheriff, but nothing was ever done. And then there were the men I'd see sometimes, parked on the road down below with binoculars, watching the farm. Samuel was scared those last few weeks, though he tried not to show it. He told me he was gathering evidence of something terrible, something that powerful people wanted to keep buried. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure his dog was cared for and that his heir knew to be careful. The mountain silence suddenly felt oppressive, the beauty of the valley taking on a more sinister cast, and Emma understood with cold certainty that Samuel's death might not have been as natural as the hospital records suggested. The first 3 days on the farm were a study in patience and persistence, as Emma slowly earned the trust of a grieving dog who saw her as an intruder in his master's domain. She established a routine, rising with the sun to feed Ranger from the supplies Helen had left, always placing his bowls in the same spot, and then retreating to the porch to give him space to eat without feeling watched or threatened. She spoke to him constantly as she moved through her days, narrating her actions in a soft, steady voice, telling him about the work she was doing to clean the farmhouse, the discoveries she was making in Samuel's simple life, the way the mountain air made her feel both liberated and terribly small. Gradually, incrementally, Ranger began to accept her presence, his wariness softening into curiosity, as he watched her sweep the floors, wash the windows, and organize the pantry that held Samuel's carefully labeled jars of preserved vegetables. By the second evening, he allowed her to sit on the porch steps while he lay in the yard, the distance between them shrinking from 20 feet to 10. By the third morning, he took food directly from her hand, his warm breath on her palm, and his amber eyes holding hers for a long, significant moment that felt like acceptance. She explored the property with Ranger as her guide, following him along the creek where he would pause to drink from the cold, clear water, walking the fence lines that marked the boundaries of Samuel's 240 acres, climbing to high overlooks where she could see the entire valley spread below and understand why someone would fight to protect this place. But it was on the fourth day, when Emma decided to investigate the barn, that everything changed. The structure was weathered but solid, its doors hanging slightly crooked on their hinges, and Emma approached it with simple curiosity about what equipment or supplies Samuel might have stored inside. Ranger, who had been following her faithfully all morning, suddenly stopped 20 feet from the barn entrance, his entire body going rigid, his ears flattening against his skull. A low, anxious whine started in his chest, and when Emma called him forward, he refused, actually backing away from the building as if it contained something dangerous or deeply wrong. She tried 3 times to coax him closer, but each attempt only increased his distress until he was pacing back and forth, whining continuously, his gaze fixed on the barn doors, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. This was not simple fear or reluctance. This was the behavior of a dog who knew something, who had been trained or had learned through experience that this particular building held significance his human needed to understand. Emma stood watching Ranger's agitation, remembering Helen's warnings about strange things happening on the property, remembering Samuel's dying words about poison and buried truth, and she felt the brass key heavy in her pocket as she made her decision. Whatever was in that barn, whatever secret it held that could cause such distress in a loyal dog, she was going to find it, and she was going to understand exactly what Samuel Hartwell had died trying to protect. Emma approached the barn alone, leaving Ranger pacing anxiously in the yard, his whines following her, as she pulled open the heavy doors and stepped into the dim interior that smelled of old hay and motor oil. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, with a hayloft above, and various farm implements scattered across the dirt floor. A rusted plough, coils of wire fencing, wooden crates stacked against the walls. She searched methodically, looking for anything that might explain Ranger's intense distress, running her hands along the walls, checking behind the stacked equipment, finding nothing but decades of accumulated farm debris. She was about to give up, thinking perhaps the dog's anxiety was simply grief manifesting in strange ways when her boot caught on something, and she stumbled, barely catching herself against a workbench. She looked down at what had tripped her and saw a corner of the dirt floor that didn't quite match the rest, a rectangular section where the earth seemed more compact, more deliberately placed. She knelt and brushed away the loose dirt with her hands, revealing the edge of a wooden trapdoor, its seams nearly invisible under the carefully scattered soil that had concealed it. Her heart hammering now with the certainty that she'd found something significant, Emma cleared away more dirt until she could grip the iron ring set into the wood, and with considerable effort she heaved the door open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness below. She retrieved a flashlight from the workbench, tested its beam, and climbed down into what proved to be a small cellar, perhaps 10 feet square, its walls lined with wooden shelves that held dozens upon dozens of sealed glass jars and plastic containers. Each one was filled with either dark water or soil samples, and each bore a white label marked with dates spanning 15 years and GPS coordinates written in Samuel's precise handwriting. On a small table in the center of the cellar sat a stack of leather-bound journals, their covers worn from frequent handling, and beside them was a box containing what looked like testing equipment, pH meters, chemical reagent kits, sample collection tools. Emma set the flashlight down and opened the first journal, its pages filled with Samuel's methodical documentation. Dates, locations, water clarity readings, photographs taped to pages showing dead fish, discolored streams, vegetation dying along creek banks. She read entries describing his growing horror as he realized the scope of contamination, his meticulous mapping of Apex Mining's illegal disposal sites hidden in remote mountain watersheds, his detailed chemical analysis showing levels of arsenic, lead, and industrial solvents far beyond safe limits. He documented everything with the precision of a scientist, building an irrefutable case: livestock deaths on downstream ranches, increases in cancer rates in the small communities that drew their water from the affected watersheds, and most damning, internal communications he'd somehow obtained that showed Apex Mining knew exactly what they were doing, and had calculated that the remote location and sparse population made the risk of discovery acceptably low. Emma sat in that hidden cellar, reading by flashlight for over an hour, and with each page she understood more clearly why Samuel had died, and why Richard Vance had appeared so quickly with his cash offer for worthless land. The deeper Emma read into Samuel's journals, the more the fragmented pieces of his life assembled into a coherent and tragic whole. The earliest entries, dating back nearly 20 years, revealed that Samuel Hartwell hadn't always been a simple mountain farmer, but rather Dr. Samuel Hartwell, an environmental scientist with a PhD in hydrology, who had worked for the EPA before retiring to this remote valley, seeking peace and a simpler life. His scientific training had made him observant in ways most farmers weren't, and 5 years into his retirement, he'd noticed something wrong with the creek that ran through his property: a subtle discoloration during certain times of year, an oily sheen on the water's surface, and most troubling, the disappearance of the trout that had once been abundant in these streams. His curiosity had led him to begin informal testing, and what he'd discovered had transformed his peaceful retirement into a 15-year crusade. Apex Mining operated a processing facility 30 miles upstream in a canyon so remote that few people even knew of its existence, and Samuel's investigation revealed they were using that isolation as cover for systematic illegal dumping of toxic waste from their rare earth mineral extraction process. The journals documented his painstaking detective work, hiking to remote sites with his sample collection kit, following discolored tributaries to their sources, discovering disposal sites hidden in box canyons, where drums of chemical waste had been simply buried or dumped into underground streams. He'd mapped an entire network of contamination spreading through the watershed like a cancer, and his scientific analysis showed toxin levels that were catastrophic. The most Heartbreaking entries detailed the consequences he'd observed. A neighboring ranch where half the cattle herd died mysteriously, their organs showing clear signs of heavy metal poisoning. A small community 40 miles downstream, where the cancer rate had tripled in a decade. Children born with developmental issues that doctors couldn't explain, but that Samuel's data suggested were directly linked to contaminated well water. He'd tried to report his findings through official channels, submitting detailed reports to the EPA, the State Environmental Agency, and even directly to the governor's office. But every attempt had been met with bureaucratic delays, lost paperwork, or outright dismissal. The journals grew increasingly frustrated and fearful as Samuel realized that Apex Mining's influence ran deep, that they had politicians, regulators, and law enforcement on their payroll, and that his evidence, no matter how damning, would be buried by the same system meant to protect people from exactly this kind of corporate crime. The final entries, written in the weeks before his death, showed a man who knew he was running out of time. Both physically, as an unnamed illness ravaged his body with symptoms that looked suspiciously like heavy metal poisoning, and practically as he realized that Apex had discovered his investigation and was moving to silence him permanently. His last entry, dated just 3 days before he was hospitalized, was addressed directly to Emma, though he used only her first name, and it read, "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and the responsibility falls to you now. I'm sorry for that burden, sorrier than you can know, but you're the only one I can trust with this truth. They think they've won, think they can bury the evidence with me, but they don't know about you. Make them pay for what they've done. Make them answer for every poisoned stream, every dead animal, every sick child. Don't let my life's work die with me." Emma had just emerged from the barn, her mind reeling from the scope of Samuel's evidence, when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching up the mountain road. Ranger, who had been lying in the shade of the porch, immediately rose to his feet, his body going rigid, a low rumble starting deep in his chest that was unlike any sound she'd heard from him before. A white SUV with official-looking county seals on the doors pulled into the clearing, and the man who stepped out was perhaps 40, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with a laminated badge clipped to his belt. He moved with the casual confidence of authority, carrying a clipboard and barely glancing at Emma as he announced he was from the county health department, that there had been complaints about unsanitary conditions on the property, and that he was here to conduct an immediate inspection. Emma's instincts, honed by 18 years of navigating the orphanage's complex social hierarchies and learning to spot when adults were lying, immediately told her something was wrong. The man's badge was too new, his credentials too generic, and most tellingly, he showed no interest in actually inspecting anything, his eyes instead constantly scanning the property, as if looking for something specific. When she asked to see his identification more closely, he waved her off impatiently and started walking toward the barn, saying he didn't need her permission, and that obstruction of a health inspection was a serious offense. That's when Ranger moved, placing himself directly between the man and the barn entrance, his lips pulling back to reveal impressive teeth, his growl escalating into something truly menacing. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute, the grieving, wary dog replaced by a trained guardian who recognized a threat to his territory and his new person. The inspector stopped, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt, in a gesture that had nothing to do with health regulations and everything to do with someone accustomed to carrying a weapon, and Emma saw fear flicker across his face as he reassessed the situation. She called Ranger to her side, and the dog obeyed, but remained in a defensive posture, never taking his eyes off the intruder, his message crystal clear: approach Emma or the barn, and there would be consequences. The man's demeanor changed then, the pretense of official business dropping away like a discarded mask, replaced by something cold and calculating. He looked at Emma with an expression that made her skin crawl, and said in a voice devoid of any official courtesy that accidents happened all the time in the mountains, that isolated properties were dangerous places, that young women living alone sometimes simply disappeared, and no one knew what became of them. Fires started from faulty wiring, he continued, his tone almost conversational. And wildlife could be unpredictable, and sometimes people just made poor decisions that led to tragic outcomes. He let the words hang in the air like a noose, then climbed back into his SUV and drove away, leaving Emma standing in the clearing with Ranger pressed against her legs, both of them understanding with perfect clarity that the warning had been delivered, and that Samuel's enemies now knew she'd found his evidence and had no intention of walking away. The visit from the fake inspector left Emma shaken and angry in equal measure, and she knew she needed answers that the dead man's journals couldn't provide. Helen Drummond had said she was Samuel's closest neighbor, and the next morning Emma made the drive down the winding mountain road to the modest cabin that sat in a clearing 3 miles from Samuel's farm, Ranger riding in the passenger seat, as if understanding they were on a mission together. Helen answered the door before Emma could knock, her weathered face showing she'd been expecting this visit, and she ushered them inside to a cozy kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. They sat at a worn table while, Helen poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and Emma saw in the old woman's eyes a burden that had been carried too long, a truth that needed finally to be spoken. Helen began by asking if Emma had found Samuel's evidence, and when Emma nodded, the old woman's shoulders sagged with something like relief, mixed with sorrow. "Then you know why they killed him," Helen said bluntly, the words hanging in the warm kitchen air. "And you need to know the rest, or the part he could never bring himself to tell you directly." She reached across the table and took Emma's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong, and spoke words that shattered everything Emma thought she understood about her identity. Samuel Hartwell wasn't a stranger who'd left her his farm out of some inexplicable whim. He was her grandfather, and the woman in the photograph that looked so much like Emma was Sarah Hartwell, Samuel's only child, Emma's mother. Helen's voice grew thick with emotion as she explained that Sarah had died 18 years ago in childbirth, hemorrhaging in the small mountain hospital where Emma had watched Samuel take his last breath. The same hospital where Emma had taken her first. Samuel had been alone, a widower trying to raise an infant while simultaneously building his case against Apex Mining, and in the weeks after Sarah's death, the threats had escalated from vandalism to direct violence. Someone had shot at him on his own property, Helen said, and that's when Samuel made the hardest decision of his life. He gave Emma up, placing her with St. Catherine's Orphanage in Denver, where she would be anonymous, safe, far from the mountain war he was waging. But he'd never stopped watching over her, Helen continued, her eyes bright with tears, never stopped loving her. He'd made regular anonymous donations to the orphanage that funded improvements to the dormitories, the library, the kitchen. He'd attended every school play Emma had been in, sitting in the back where she wouldn't notice him, and he'd kept every report card, every school photo, every scrap of evidence of her life in a box hidden in his bedroom closet. He'd sacrificed knowing his only grandchild, sacrificed the family he desperately wanted, because keeping her alive and safe mattered more than his own happiness, and he'd planned to tell her everything when Apex Mining was finally brought to justice. Emma returned to the farm with her world inverted, her entire identity rewritten in the span of a single conversation, and she spent that evening going through the box Helen had mentioned, finding it exactly where the old woman said it would be. In Samuel's bedroom closet, a simple wooden container filled with 18 years of a grandfather's silent love. She held her school photos, read the report cards he'd saved, touched the playbill from a 5th-grade production of Annie, where her name was circled in red pen, and wept for the family she'd never known she had, and for the man who'd loved her enough to let her go. She was still processing this revelation 2 days later, when the sound of an expensive engine announced another visitor. And this time, it wasn't a fake inspector or a corporate acquisitions officer. but James Whitmore himself, CEO of Apex Mining, arriving in a black luxury SUV with tinted windows and the quiet arrogance of immense wealth and power. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in casual clothes that probably cost more than Emma had spent on everything she owned, and he approached the porch where she sat with Ranger at her feet, as if he were doing her an enormous favor by breathing the same mountain air. His smile was practiced and warm, the expression of a man accustomed to charming his way through obstacles, and he began by apologizing for the previous representatives who'd approached her, saying they'd been too aggressive, too insensitive to her recent loss. He understood she was processing difficult emotions, he said smoothly, discovering she had roots in this place, and he wanted to make things right with an offer that reflected the property's true value to his company. $300,000 cash, plus a position in Apex Mining's corporate offices in Denver, with a generous salary and full benefits. A chance for a young woman with no family and no prospects to build a real future. He laid it out like a gift, like he was her benefactor instead of her grandfather's killer, and Emma felt rage burning cold in her chest as she looked at him and said simply, "No." The transformation was immediate and chilling, Whitmore's pleasant mask dissolving to reveal the predator beneath, his smile becoming something sharp and dangerous. He sat down on the porch railing, uninvited, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than any shout. "Your grandfather was a smart man, Emma," he said, using her first name with false intimacy. "He knew when to push and when to back down. That's why he lived as long as he did. His death was entirely natural, the unfortunate result of illness that comes to all men eventually, because he understood that some fights can't be won, and some truths are better left buried. I'm offering you the same wisdom he eventually accepted. Walk away, take the money, build a life somewhere far from here, and forget about whatever misguided crusade you think you're inheriting. The alternative is to learn the same lessons he did, but much more quickly and much less pleasantly." He stood then, brushing invisible dust from his expensive pants, and delivered his final warning with the casual certainty of a man who'd never faced real consequences. "Accidents happen in these mountains all the time, and young women living alone are terribly vulnerable. It would be a shame if you became another tragedy." Whitmore's threats had the opposite effect of what he'd intended, hardening Emma's resolve into something unbreakable. And the morning after his visit, she loaded a backpack with water, Samuel's journals, a handheld GPS unit she'd found in his study, and sample collection materials, determined to see with her own eyes what her grandfather had documented so meticulously. Ranger seemed to understand they were embarking on something significant, staying close to her side as they set out on the first hike to coordinates Samuel had marked as Site 7, a location 5 miles into the national forest where a tributary fed into the main watershed. The terrain was rugged, the trail non-existent, and Emma had to use her grandfather's detailed notes and the GPS to navigate through dense pine forest and across rocky slopes where one wrong step could mean a twisted ankle or worse. After 2 hours of steady climbing, they reached the site, and Emma's breath caught at the devastation Samuel's dry, scientific notation had failed to convey. The stream that should have run clear and cold was instead a sickly orange-brown, its rocks coated with a rust-colored residue that Samuel's notes identified as iron oxide precipitate from acid mine drainage, and along its banks the vegetation was stunted and dying, aspens with blackened leaves and pines with needles that had turned brown and dropped prematurely. She found the skeletal remains of what had once been a deer lying beside the poisoned water, its bones scattered by scavengers, but the skull intact, a mute testament to an animal that had drunk from this stream and paid with its life. She collected water samples exactly as Samuel had taught himself to do, sealing them in glass containers and labeling them with the date and coordinates, building her own evidence to add to his. They visited 3 more sites over the next 2 days, each one revealing similar scenes of environmental catastrophe. Streams running with chemical rainbows, fish floating belly up in stagnant pools, entire hillsides where nothing grew but the hardiest weeds. It was at the 4th site, hidden in a box canyon, so remote that Emma doubted anyone had visited it in years, that Ranger made his most important discovery. The dog had been ranging ahead, nose to the ground, when he suddenly stopped and began digging furiously at a spot where the earth looked disturbed, loose soil, and rocks that had been deliberately piled. Emma joined him, pulling away the concealing debris with her hands, and her fingers struck metal. A 55-gallon industrial drum, painted white with Apex Mining's corporate logo, still visible despite years of weathering and crude attempts to scratch it away. The drum had corroded through in several places, and from the largest hole, a thick, dark sludge was actively leaking into the soil, creating a dead zone around it where nothing living could survive. Emma photographed it from every angle, documented its exact location, and collected samples of the leaking material, her hands shaking with the realization that she was holding irrefutable proof of Apex Mining's crimes, evidence so damning that no amount of corporate influence or political connections could explain it away. The harassment began the night after Emma returned from documenting the leaking drum. Subtle at first, but escalating with calculated precision designed to terrorize and isolate her. She woke on the first morning to find all 4 tires on her borrowed sedan slashed, the rubber shredded so thoroughly that the wheels sat on their rims, and scrawled in the dirt beside the vehicle was a single word: leave. The next night, she turned on the kitchen tap to find the water running brown and reeking of diesel fuel. The well that had provided clean mountain water for decades now contaminated by someone who'd dumped fuel directly down the shaft, rendering it unusable and potentially destroying the entire system. The anonymous phone calls started after that, always in the dead of night, when the mountain darkness was absolute and every sound seemed amplified, voices both male and female delivering threats in calm, emotionless tones that were somehow more frightening than rage. They knew she was alone, they said, knew she had no family to miss her, knew that bodies disappeared in these mountains all the time and were never found. Ranger became hyper-vigilant, refusing to sleep, pacing the farmhouse at all hours, and growling at sounds Emma couldn't hear, his instincts telling him that predators circled their territory, waiting for an opportunity to strike. After 3 sleepless nights of escalating terror, Emma drove into Pinewood Ridge to report the incidents to Sheriff Dale Morrison, a thick-set man in his 50s whose office reeked of stale coffee, and whose eyes held the flat, indifferent gaze of someone who'd long ago stopped caring about justice. She laid out everything: the slashed tires, the contaminated well, the threatening calls, the visit from the fake health inspector, even her suspicions about Apex Mining's involvement, and Morrison listened with an expression of barely concealed contempt, leaning back in his chair and regarding her with the patronizing dismissiveness reserved for hysterical women and troublesome outsiders. When she finished, he sighed heavily and told her that mountain living wasn't for everyone, that isolated properties attracted vandals and pranksters, that young women especially found the solitude difficult, and that maybe she should consider whether holding on to a broken-down farm was worth all this stress when she had a generous offer to sell and move somewhere more suitable to her temperament. The subtext was clear as mountain air. He knew exactly who was behind the harassment. He was part of the machinery protecting Apex Mining's interests, and she would get no help from law enforcement. Emma left his office shaking with anger rather than fear, understanding that she was truly alone in this fight, that the corruption ran deeper than she'd imagined, that every official channel and authority figure in this county had been bought or intimidated into compliance. She drove back to the farm in the sedan, with its ruined tires replaced by cheap used ones she'd bought with the last of Samuel's money, Ranger riding beside her with his head out the window. And she made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the frightened 18-year-old who'd left the orphanage just weeks ago. She would not run would not be intimidated, would not abandon her grandfather's fight or the legacy he'd died protecting. If Apex Mining and their corrupt enablers wanted her gone, they would have to drag her off this mountain, because she was Sarah Hartwell's daughter and Samuel Hartwell's granddaughter, and she had finally found her family and her purpose, and no amount of threats or harassment would make her surrender either one. Emma was in the barn, organizing Samuel's evidence into categories that would make sense to federal investigators, Ranger lying watchfully by the trapdoor when she heard a vehicle approach and immediately tensed, her hand moving instinctively to the old hunting rifle she now kept close at all times. But the voice that called out from the yard was young and carried none of the threat she'd come to expect. Instead, announcing himself as Carlos Martinez and saying he was a friend, that Samuel had been helping him with a story, and that he needed to talk to her urgently. She emerged from the barn with the rifle held ready, finding a man perhaps 30 years old standing beside a dusty, compact car, with his hands raised in a gesture of peace, his press credentials hanging prominently around his neck. He was lean and intense, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that assessed the situation quickly, taking in the rifle, the protective dog, and Emma's defensive posture without judgment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried genuine sorrow, as he said he'd only learned of Samuel's death a week ago, and had been trying to find a way to contact his heir ever since. Emma didn't lower the rifle immediately, demanding to know how he'd found her and why she should trust him, and Carlos responded by pulling out his phone and showing her months of email correspondence with Samuel, detailed discussions about Apex Mining's illegal dumping, photographs Samuel had sent of contaminated sites, and most convincingly, messages from just days before Samuel's hospitalization, where the old man had written that if anything happened to him, Carlos should find his granddaughter Emma at St. Catherine's Orphanage in Denver, because she was the only person he trusted to continue the fight. The specificity of that information, details that no one outside of Samuel and Helen should have known, convinced Emma to lower the rifle and invite Carlos inside, where he explained that he was an investigative journalist working for a non-profit news organization that specialized in environmental crimes and corporate corruption. He'd been investigating Apex Mining for 3 years, documenting a pattern of illegal practices across multiple states, but he'd never been able to get the kind of hard evidence that would stand up in court or survive the company's battery of lawyers until Samuel had contacted him with his meticulous documentation and scientific analysis. They'd been planning to publish a comprehensive expose when Samuel suddenly stopped responding to emails, and Carlos learned he'd died, and Carlos had assumed the evidence died with him until he'd made inquiries, and discovered that Samuel had an heir who'd taken possession of the property. He laid out his plan with the focused intensity of someone who'd thought through every detail. The local authorities couldn't be trusted. The state agencies were compromised by Apex's political influence, but the federal EPA and FBI had divisions specifically designed to handle cases like this, and if they could get Samuel's evidence into the right hands with proper documentation and chain of custody, Apex Mining could be brought down. But Carlos's expression grew grave as he warned Emma that going forward meant painting an even larger target on her back, that Apex would escalate from harassment to direct violence once they realized she was coordinating with journalists and federal investigators, and that she needed to be prepared for the company to use every weapon in its arsenal to silence her before the truth could be exposed. Emma listened to all of this, then looked at Ranger lying protectively at her feet, thought about her grandfather, who'd sacrificed everything, including his relationship with her, to fight this battle, and told Carlos she was already committed, that Apex had made their intentions clear, and that she'd rather die fighting for justice than live in fear. And for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt something like hope, because she was no longer alone in the wilderness facing corporate predators. She had an ally who understood the stakes and had the skills to help her grandfather's evidence finally see the light of day. Carlos had left just before sunset with copies of some of Samuel's documentation, promising to return within a week with contacts at the federal EPA who could be trusted, and Emma spent the evening cataloguing more evidence in the farmhouse, spreading journals and photographs across the kitchen table while Ranger dozed fitfully by the door. She'd finally fallen into an exhausted sleep around midnight, still dressed, the rifle propped against the wall beside the couch where she'd collapsed, when Ranger's explosive barking tore her from unconsciousness with a jolt of pure adrenaline. The dog was at the front door, his barking not the warning growl she'd heard before, but a continuous, ferocious roar that spoke of immediate threat, and through the window Emma saw the beam of a flashlight sweeping across the porch, heard the distinct sound of tools scraping against the lock mechanism. Professional and practiced, she grabbed the rifle with shaking hands, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe, and positioned herself behind the heavy wooden table as the lock gave way with a soft click and the door began to swing inward. Ranger didn't wait for them to enter. The moment there was enough space, he launched himself through the opening with a snarl that was purely predatory, 80 pounds of muscle and fury colliding with the first intruder, hard enough to send the man crashing backward off the porch with a scream of pain and terror. Emma heard cursing, the sound of men scrambling, and then Ranger was back inside, his muzzle flecked with blood that wasn't his own, positioning himself between Emma and the doorway, while his barking continued unabated. Through the window she caught glimpses of the intruders, and what she saw chilled her more than the attack itself. These weren't desperate thieves or local troublemakers, but professionals dressed in dark, tactical clothing, moving with coordinated precision, communicating through hand signals as they regrouped and assessed their situation. One of them raised what looked like a tranquilizer gun toward the doorway, clearly intending to neutralize Ranger, and Emma acted on instinct, firing the rifle through the open door into the night sky, the deafening crack of the shot echoing across the valley like thunder. The intruders scattered immediately, professional enough to know when a target had become too difficult and too loud, and she heard the sound of a vehicle starting somewhere down the road, where they'd parked out of sight, its engine fading as they retreated. Emma stood in the doorway, shaking. Ranger pressed against her legs, still growling towards the darkness, and she realized with absolute clarity that this hadn't been about intimidation or harassment, but about retrieval, about finding and destroying Samuel's evidence before it could be used against them. They'd come prepared to search the house systematically, and if she'd been alone without Ranger's warning and protection, they would have succeeded, would have torn the place apart, looking for the journals and samples, and quite possibly would have killed her to tie up the loose end she represented. The barn suddenly felt terribly vulnerable, its hidden cellar containing the most damning evidence, but protected by nothing more than old wood and a trapdoor that any professional could find if they had time to search properly. She couldn't defend both the house and the barn simultaneously, couldn't stay awake every night waiting for the next attack, and she understood with sinking certainty that Apex Mining had moved from covert harassment to open warfare, and that the fragile safety of her isolated mountain farm had just been shattered beyond repair. Emma spent the hours after the attack moving the most critical evidence from the barn cellar into the farmhouse, creating multiple hiding places throughout the building, behind loose floorboards and inside hollowed-out beams, operating on the principle that scattered evidence was harder to destroy completely than a single cache. As dawn broke and pale light filtered through the windows, she sat exhausted at the kitchen table, with Ranger's head heavy on her lap, methodically reading through Samuel's journals again, searching for anything she might have missed, any contingency plan her grandfather might have left for exactly this situation. It was in the third journal, on a page she'd skimmed over before thinking it was just more documentation of collection sites, that she found it. An entry different from all the others, written not in Samuel's usual clinical scientific notation, but in the more personal, almost poetic language of a man leaving a message for someone who would understand. "The mountain weeps in the place where Sarah loved to play as a child," he'd written, "where the water falls and sings its ancient song, where the stone holds secrets in its cool embrace. There I have placed insurance against the day when they come for what I've gathered, sealed against time and protected by the mountain itself. Samples from the very beginning when I first understood the scope of their crime. Irreplaceable originals that can prove the contamination spans decades, not years. Emma read the passage 3 times, her exhaustion-fogged mind struggling to decode what Samuel had meant. And then the pieces clicked together with the force of revelation. Her mother Sarah, the waterfall she'd heard, but not yet explored on the northern edge of the property, a place where water literally wept from the mountain face. She pulled out the topographical map of the farm and traced the creek upstream to where it originated, finding the notation for a waterfall marked in Samuel's careful hand with a small star that she'd assumed was just a landmark, but now understood was something more. The hike would take her far from the house, into terrain she didn't know, and leaving the farm undefended felt dangerous, but the original samples Samuel described would be crucial evidence, impossible to dismiss as recently fabricated or contaminated, scientific proof that could establish a timeline of Apex Mining's crimes, stretching back to when their operations first began poisoning the watershed. She packed quickly, filling her backpack with water, rope, the flashlight, and basic climbing gear she'd found in Samuel's supplies, and by mid-morning she and Ranger were pushing through dense forest toward the sound of falling water that grew steadily louder as they climbed. The waterfall, when they finally reached it after 2 hours of difficult hiking, was more beautiful than she'd imagined. A 30-foot curtain of water cascading down a moss-covered cliff face into a clear pool below, the spray creating rainbows in the mountain sun, and behind the falls, partially obscured by the water's veil, she could see a dark opening in the rock, a cave exactly as Samuel had described. Getting to it would require climbing wet rocks and passing through the waterfall's spray, dangerous work that could result in a fall into the pool, or worse. But Emma understood that her grandfather had chosen this location precisely because it was difficult to access, because casual searchers would never find it, and because the mountain itself would protect what he'd hidden there. The climb to the cave was the most physically demanding thing Emma had ever attempted, requiring her to edge along a narrow ledge slick with spray, while the waterfall thundered mere feet away, its roar drowning out all thought, and its mist soaking her completely within seconds. Ranger couldn't follow, his canine anatomy unsuited to the precise handholds and delicate balance required, so he waited at the base of the falls, pacing anxiously and whining as he watched Emma inch her way across the treacherous rock face toward the dark opening behind the water's veil. Twice her boot slipped on the wet stone, and only her desperate grip on a thin crack in the rock face kept her from plunging into the pool below. And by the time she finally hauled herself into the cave's mouth, her arms were shaking with exhaustion, and her heart was hammering against her ribs. The cave was small and shallow, more of an alcove than a true cavern, but it was dry and protected from the elements, and there at the back, exactly as Samuel had promised, sat a large waterproof plastic container of the kind used by river rafters and mountaineers, its lid secured with heavy-duty latches and a combination lock whose numbers Samuel had written in the journal's margins, disguised as GPS coordinates. Emma's cold-numbed fingers fumbled with the lock, entering the sequence twice before it clicked open, and when she lifted the lid, she found herself staring at perhaps 50 carefully labeled sample jars arranged in foam padding, each one representing a different location and date, the earliest marked 15 years ago, when Samuel had first understood what was happening to his mountain paradise. Beneath the samples was a thick envelope sealed with wax, and with trembling hands, Emma opened it to find a letter, written in her grandfather's precise script, addressed simply, "To Emma, my granddaughter, my heart." The letter contained everything. The full story of how Samuel had discovered the dumping, how he'd tried to report it through proper channels, only to find that Apex Mining's influence had corrupted every level of government, from local sheriffs to state environmental officials. How 3 other farmers who'd tried to speak out had died in accidents that were anything but accidental. How the company had systematically silenced opposition through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and, when necessary, murder. Samuel wrote about the impossible choice he'd faced when Emma was born. and the threats against him escalated into direct attempts on his life. The agonizing decision to give up the only family he had left, because raising a child while fighting this battle would have painted a target on her back that his conscience couldn't bear. He explained that he'd watched her from a distance every chance he could, that every school performance he'd attended sitting in the shadows, every donation he'd made to improve her life at the orphanage, every birthday that had passed without him being able to hold her, had been a knife to his heart, but that her safety had mattered more than his own happiness. The letter's final paragraph made tears stream down Emma's already wet face, as Samuel wrote that he'd willed her the land, not as a burden, but as an apology and an inheritance of truth, that she deserved to know who she was and where she came from, that she deserved the choice he'd never had, to walk away from this fight with money and a future, or to finish what he'd started and make the powerful answer for their crimes, and that whatever she chose, he loved her and was proud of her, and his only regret was not having the courage to love her openly while he lived. Emma sealed Samuel's letter and the precious samples back in the waterproof container, secured it in her backpack, and made the harrowing climb back down the wet rock face, every muscle in her body screaming with fatigue, but her mind clear with purpose, and the weight of her grandfather's love settling into her bones like strength. Ranger greeted her return with obvious relief, pressing against her legs and whining softly, and they began the long hike back towards the farmhouse through the dense forest. Emma's mind already racing through plans for how to get the evidence to Carlos, and from there to federal authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated. They'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes, following the creek downstream through a particularly thick stand of pines, when Ranger suddenly froze mid-step, every muscle in his body going rigid, his ears pricked forward and rotating to catch sounds Emma's duller human hearing couldn't detect. A low growl started in his chest, different from his warning growls at the house, this one urgent and commanding, and before Emma could ask what was wrong, he grabbed her jacket sleeve in his teeth and pulled her off the trail into the dense undergrowth with surprising force. She barely had time to crouch down behind a fallen log before she heard what Ranger had detected. Voices, male, professional, communicating in terse phrases that carried through the forest, and through gaps in the foliage she saw them. 2 men in tactical gear, carrying rifles, moving up the trail she'd just left, clearly tracking her route toward the waterfall. They'd been waiting and watching, had seen her leave the farmhouse that morning, and followed at a distance, and now they were hunting her with the methodical patience of professionals who knew their quarry would have to return by the same path. Emma's blood turned to ice as she realized the trap they'd set, but Ranger was already moving, leading her not back the way they'd come, but on a parallel route that climbed steeply up the mountainside through terrain so rough and treacherous that no sane person would attempt it. The dog navigated with absolute confidence, choosing a path through deadfall and over rocky outcroppings that would have been invisible to Emma, occasionally looking back to ensure she was following, his intimate knowledge of the land gained through years of running these mountains, with Samuel now deployed to save his new master's life. Behind them, she heard shouts as the men realized their prey had escaped the trap, heard them crashing through the brush in pursuit, and once a rifle shot cracked through the trees, the bullet striking a trunk 10 feet from where Emma scrambled up a steep embankment. Ranger led her through a nightmare maze of obstacles, across a creek at a narrow point, where stepping stones were barely visible, through a thicket of thorns so dense she emerged bleeding from a dozen scratches, up slopes where loose shale threatened to send her sliding back down into the arms of her pursuers. The chase lasted over an hour, Emma's lungs burning in the thin mountain air, her legs threatening to give out. But gradually the sounds of pursuit faded as the rough terrain and Ranger's superior knowledge of the land opened distance between them. When they finally burst from the tree line into the clearing where the farmhouse stood, Emma was sobbing with exhaustion and relief, and she staggered inside with Ranger, immediately barricading the door with furniture and pulling out her phone to call Carlos with shaking hands, telling him between gasps for air that Apex had sent armed men, that they were actively hunting her, and that she needed federal help immediately before the next attack came, because she knew with absolute certainty there would be a next attack, and she might not survive it. Carlos's voice on the phone had been grim as he told Emma that his federal contacts were mobilizing, but needed 48 hours to coordinate a proper response and get agents into the remote mountain region. And she'd barely processed that timeline when she looked out the window and saw what was coming. A wall of bruised purple-black clouds rolling over the peaks like an avalanche, the leading edge of a spring snowstorm that the weather radio was already calling historic. Within an hour, the first flakes began to fall, fat and heavy, and within 2 hours, the world outside had transformed into a swirling white chaos that reduced visibility to mere feet and turned the road down the mountain into an impassable drift. Emma watched the storm's fury with a sinking heart, understanding that she was now completely cut off, that no help could reach her, and she couldn't escape even if she wanted to, that Apex's hired guns were somewhere out there in the blizzard, and the storm that had trapped her had also given them perfect cover for whatever they planned to do. She spent the failing daylight preparing the farmhouse for siege, moving systematically through the space with the cold focus of someone who understood survival depended on preparation. She filled every container she could find with water from the taps before the pipes froze, stacked firewood inside until the living room resembled a lumberyard, moved furniture to create defensive positions with clear sightlines to the doors and windows, and laid out Samuel's hunting rifle with all the ammunition she could find, 37 rounds that would have to be enough, because there would be no resupply. She distributed the evidence throughout the house in multiple hiding places, operating on the grim calculation that if they killed her, at least some of it might survive to be found later. And she wrote a letter to Carlos explaining everything, and sealed it in a waterproof bag that she tucked into the woodpile, where searchers might eventually discover it. As darkness fell and the storm reached its full fury, the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing trying to tear it from its foundation, Ranger's behavior became increasingly agitated in ways that terrified Emma more than the storm. The dog refused to settle, pacing from window to window with his hackles raised, periodically freezing to stare intently at the white chaos beyond the glass and growling low in his chest. He was tracking something out there, multiple somethings, his superior senses picking up presences that Emma couldn't see or hear, and she realized with cold certainty that Apex's people hadn't retreated when the storm hit, but had instead closed in, using the blizzard as cover to surround the property, waiting for their moment. She sat in the darkness with only the fire for light, not wanting to make herself a target by using the lamps, the rifle across her lap, and Ranger a tense shadow beside her, and listened to the storm rage while knowing that somewhere in that white fury, men with guns were circling her grandfather's farmhouse like wolves around wounded prey. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, each creak of the house in the wind making her start, each change in Ranger's growl pattern, sending adrenaline spiking through her system. And Emma understood she was living the same nightmare Samuel had faced, trapped and alone against enemies who had all the resources and all the ruthlessness, while she had only her grandfather's rifle, a loyal dog, and a desperate determination not to let the truth die with her in this mountain storm. The attack came at midnight, when the storm was at its most violent, the howling wind providing perfect acoustic cover for the sound of boots crunching through deep snow. And Emma's first warning was Ranger exploding into frenzied barking, directed at the back of the house, where a window shattered, glass spraying inward as a gloved hand reached through to unlock it from inside. She fired the rifle from her defensive position behind the overturned table, the shot deliberately high to warn rather than kill, and the hand withdrew instantly, but even as she was turning back to cover the front door, Ranger was already there, his savage barking announcing another attempt at the main entrance where someone was working on the lock with professional speed. Emma realized with sinking horror that they were probing multiple entry points simultaneously, trying to divide her attention and find the weakest point in her defenses. And for the next 4 hours, she lived a nightmare of constant motion and terror, racing from window to window again, firing warning shots that became increasingly less warning, and more genuine attempts to stop the intruders who seemed inexhaustible in their assault. Twice, Ranger saved her life in ways that left her shaking with gratitude and horror. The first, when a man finally succeeded in breaking through the back window and was climbing inside, his rifle coming up to aim at Emma's back while she was focused on the front door, and Ranger hit him like a missile, jaws clamping onto the man's arm with such force that the rifle clattered to the floor, and the screaming attacker fell backward out the window into the snow. The second time was even closer, when Emma was reloading the rifle with trembling, exhausted hands, and didn't see the door beginning to give way under a battering ram until Ranger threw himself against it, his 80 pounds of muscle and fury holding it closed, just long enough for Emma to bring the rifle up and fire 3 rapid shots through the wood, hearing a cry of pain and the sound of someone falling heavily on the porch. She knew she'd hit one of them, knew from the quality of the scream and the amount of blood she could see seeping under the door that the wound was serious, and for a brief, blessed interval, the assault paused as the mercenaries regrouped and dealt with their casualty. Emma used those precious minutes to reinforce the door with more furniture, to reload with shaking hands, to give Ranger water and check him for injuries, finding him bleeding from several cuts but still alert and ready, still willing to throw himself between her and danger without hesitation. The storm began to lessen as dawn approached, the howling wind dropping to a steady moan, and Emma realized with despair that the improved visibility would only help her attackers, would allow them to coordinate more effectively and find weaknesses in her defenses that the darkness and chaos had hidden. She was down to 11 rounds of ammunition. Her body was shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline crash, and Ranger, despite his courage, was limping now from injuries she hadn't had time to properly examine. They'd survived the night, but Emma knew with cold certainty that the siege wasn't over, that Apex's mercenaries were simply waiting for full daylight to launch a final, overwhelming assault that she probably couldn't survive. The dawn light was grey and cold, filtering through the thinning storm clouds to reveal a landscape buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, and Emma was at the front window, watching for movement, when she saw the first curl of smoke rising from the barn, black and oily against the white world, and her heart dropped into her stomach as she understood what they were doing. The mercenaries had abandoned their attempts to breach the house's defenses, and were now trying to destroy the evidence at its source, flames already licking up the barn's weathered walls as the accelerant they'd used caught and spread with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed, the fire roaring even above the wind, and Emma watched in horror as 15 years of her grandfather's meticulous documentation went up in smoke, the hidden cellar that had started this entire nightmare now becoming a furnace that would leave nothing but ash. But the barn fire served a second, more immediate purpose, and she realized it too late. The wind was carrying thick, toxic smoke directly towards the farmhouse, and already it was seeping through cracks in the walls, burning her eyes and throat, making it impossible to breathe without coughing. They were smoking her out like a rabbit from its burrow, forcing her to choose between suffocation inside or exposure to their guns outside, and she knew she had perhaps 5 minutes before the smoke made staying inside impossible. Emma made her decision with the clarity that comes from having no real choice. She grabbed the waterproof container with Samuel's original samples and his letter, shoved it into her backpack along with copies of the most critical journal pages, pulled on her warmest coat, and looked at Ranger, who was coughing now too, his eyes streaming from the smoke. "We run," she told him, her voice hoarse, and she could have sworn the dog understood not just the word, but the desperate plan forming in her mind. The cave behind the waterfall was 2 miles through deep snow and hostile territory, but it was defensible, isolated, and most importantly, it was where Carlos knew to tell the federal agents to look for her if she didn't answer her phone. She moved to the back of the house, to the window the mercenary had broken during the night assault, and used the rifle butt to clear away the remaining glass, then boosted Ranger through first, watching as he dropped into the snow and immediately sank to his chest. She threw the backpack out after him, then the rifle, and finally squeezed through herself, landing hard in the deep drift and feeling the cold hit her like a physical blow. The smoke from the burning barn was thick here, providing momentary cover, and Emma used it, running as best she could through snow that grabbed at her legs with every step, Ranger ploughing a path ahead of her with his superior strength and 4-legged stability. Behind them, she heard shouts as the mercenaries realized their quarry was escaping, heard the crack of rifle fire, and felt the terrifying zip of a bullet passing close enough to her head that she could feel its displacement of air. She didn't look back, couldn't afford to, just focused on keeping her feet moving and following Ranger's path as he led her toward the tree line, where the dense pines would provide cover. More shots followed, kicking up snow around them, and Emma knew it was only the difficult visibility and her erratic movement through the deep drifts that kept her alive. That and the fact that shooting accurately while also trying to pursue through waist-deep snow was nearly impossible. They reached the trees and plunged into their shelter, the thick branches providing blessed concealment from the shooters behind them. And Emma kept running, her lungs burning, her legs screaming with exhaustion, while behind her the farmhouse that had been her grandfather's home and her brief sanctuary stood untouched but uninhabitable, and the barn that had held his life's work collapsed into a pile of burning rubble. She had nothing now but the evidence on her back, the dog at her side, and the slim hope that she could reach the cave and hold out long enough for help to arrive, assuming help was even coming, assuming Carlos had been able to mobilize federal agents, assuming she wasn't going to die alone in a mountain cave while corporate assassins waited outside for her to freeze or starve. The trek to the waterfall was a desperate race against both pursuers and exposure. Emma stumbling through snowdrifts that sometimes reached her waist, while Ranger broke trail ahead of her. And twice she fell completely, burying herself in the cold white suffocation and having to claw her way back to the surface with hands that had lost most feeling. She could hear the mercenaries behind her, their shouts echoing through the forest, but the heavy snow that made her progress agonizing also slowed them. And Ranger's knowledge of the terrain kept leading her along paths that were marginally easier, along ridges where the wind had scoured the snow thinner, under dense pine canopies where the accumulation was less. After 90 minutes of brutal hiking that felt like hours, she heard it, the roar of the waterfall, muted by winter but still unmistakable, and she nearly sobbed with relief as they broke through the last stand of trees and saw the frozen cascade, the water still flowing behind a curtain of massive icicles that had transformed the falls into something from a fairy tale. The climb to the cave was even more treacherous than before, the rocks now coated with ice. But desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed, and she hauled herself up the narrow ledge, with Ranger somehow managing to follow, his claws finding purchase where her boots slipped, until they both tumbled into the cave's shelter and lay gasping on the stone floor. Emma's entire body was shaking with cold and exhaustion, her clothes soaked through with snow and sweat, but she forced herself to move, to pull out the waterproof container and verify that Samuel's samples were intact, then to dig through her backpack for her phone, praying that it still had battery and that the mountain terrain would allow signal. The phone screen glowed to life, showing 30% battery and 2 bars of signal, a miracle she didn't question, and with numb fingers she opened the email app and began the most important message she would ever send. Carlos had helped her prepare for exactly this contingency, had shown her how to compress and encrypt the the digital documentation he'd helped her compile, scans of Samuel's journals, photographs of the contaminated sites, lab reports, GPS coordinates of disposal locations, and most damning, the internal Apex mining communications Samuel had somehow obtained that showed the company's executives knew exactly what they were doing. She attached everything to an email, and then, following Carlos's instructions, sent it not to one recipient, but to 20. The EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, the FBI's Environmental Crimes Task Force, the Department of Justice, the State Attorney General's Office, and a dozen major news organizations, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 3 television networks. The subject line was simple and devastating. Apex Mining, 15 years of illegal toxic waste dumping in Colorado watershed. Evidence from murdered whistleblower, Dr. Samuel Hartwell. She added a brief message explaining who she was, that she was currently trapped by armed mercenaries hired by Apex Mining, that her grandfather had been killed for gathering this evidence, and that if anyone was reading this email, she was probably already dead, but the truth needed to survive, even if she didn't. Her finger hovered over the send button for just a moment, understanding that this action would detonate a bomb under Apex Mining's corporate empire, would unleash investigations that couldn't be stopped or buried, would honor her grandfather's sacrifice and potentially save countless lives downstream from the poisoned watersheds. And then she pressed send and watched the progress bar fill, watched the confirmation messages appear, and felt something like peace settle over her, even as her body continued to shiver with cold. The trap was sprung. The evidence was beyond Apex's reach now, scattered across dozens of servers and inboxes, and whether she survived the next hours or not, Samuel Hartwell's truth would finally be told, and the corporation that had murdered him would face the justice he'd spent his life pursuing. Emma had spent the night pressed against Ranger for warmth in the shallow cave, both of them shivering uncontrollably as their body heat slowly drained into the stone, her phone long dead, and her mind drifting in and out of hypothermic confusion, where she sometimes thought she heard her grandfather's voice telling her to hold on, that help was coming, that she'd done everything right. She woke to silence, the kind of profound mountain quiet that comes after a storm has exhausted itself, and weak sunlight was streaming through the waterfall's icy curtain, making the cave entrance glow like stained glass. Ranger stirred beside her, whining softly, and Emma tried to sit up, but her muscles wouldn't respond properly, everything sluggish and disconnected, and she realized with distant alarm that they were both suffering from severe exposure, and if help didn't come soon, the cold would finish what Apex's mercenaries had started. That's when she heard it, not the sound of men pursuing through snow, but something else entirely, a rhythmic thumping that grew steadily louder, reverberating off the canyon walls, and through the cave's entrance she saw them. 2 helicopters appearing over the ridge like mechanical angels, one bearing the unmistakable markings of the FBI, and the other the EPA's distinctive livery. Her eyes filled with tears that froze on her cheeks as the aircraft circled the waterfall, spotlights sweeping across the cliff face until they found the cave entrance, and a voice amplified through a loudspeaker called her name, told her help was here, told her to stay where she was while they deployed rescue personnel. The next hour passed in a blur of organized chaos as rappelling specialists descended from the hovering helicopters, secured Emma and Ranger in rescue harnesses, and lifted them to safety while below, a ground team of federal agents in tactical gear spread out across the property. Emma watched from the helicopter's open door, wrapped in thermal blankets as the scene unfolded at the burned farmhouse. Agents emerging from the tree line with weapons drawn, converging on a group of men who'd been waiting in the clearing, and she recognized James Whitmore among them, the CEO himself present for what he'd thought would be the final cleanup operation, standing beside his hired mercenaries in expensive winter gear that marked him as clearly out of place in this wilderness battlefield. The agents moved with overwhelming force and precision, and within minutes, Whitmore and 6 of his men were face down in the snow with hands zip-tied behind their backs, their weapons confiscated, their confident assumption of victory shattered by the arrival of federal authority they couldn't bribe or intimidate. The helicopter carrying Emma touched down in a cleared area near the farmhouse, and she was immediately surrounded by EMTs who began treating her for hypothermia and exposure, while a woman in an FBI jacket approached, introducing herself as Special Agent Sarah Chen, and saying that Carlos Martinez had been calling every hour demanding updates, that her email had reached every intended recipient and created an immediate firestorm of investigation, and that Apex Mining's offices in Denver were currently being raided by federal agents, executing warrants for everything from environmental crimes to conspiracy to commit murder. Emma asked about the evidence, her voice barely a whisper, and Agent Chen smiled grimly and told her that Samuel's original samples were now in federal custody, that the forensic team was already in the cave retrieving the waterproof container, and that combined with the digital documentation she'd sent, they had enough evidence to dismantle Apex Mining's entire corporate structure and send its executives to prison for decades. As Emma sat in the warm helicopter watching Ranger receive veterinary attention for his injuries, watching Whitmore being loaded into a federal transport vehicle with his expensive facade finally cracked to reveal the desperate criminal beneath, watching agents carefully documenting the burned barn and the bullet-riddled farmhouse, she felt something break loose inside her chest, the terrible tension that had held her together for weeks finally releasing, and she wept for her grandfather, who hadn't lived to see this justice, for her mother she'd never known, and for herself, the orphan girl who'd stumbled into a legacy of courage and found the strength to honor it. The unraveling of Apex Mining happened with the swift, inexorable force of an avalanche, and Emma watched it from a hospital bed in Denver, where she was recovering from frostbite and pneumonia, Carlos sitting beside her, with his laptop showing her the cascading headlines that dominated every news outlet in the country. The evidence she'd preserved and transmitted proved to be even more devastating than Samuel had hoped, and within 72 hours of her rescue, federal prosecutors had assembled a grand jury that returned indictments against James Whitmore and the entire Apex Mining Board of Directors on charges that included conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, wire fraud, racketeering, and, in Whitmore's case, conspiracy to commit murder for his direct involvement in ordering the attacks on Emma. The speed of the indictments was unprecedented, driven by the undeniable nature of Samuel's scientific documentation, and the public outrage that exploded when news organizations published stories about a dying scientist's 15-year battle against corporate poisoning and his orphaned granddaughter's desperate fight to honor his legacy. Sheriff Morrison was arrested attempting to flee the county with $50,000 in cash that investigators later proved came directly from Apex Mining's slush fund, and 3 county commissioners were charged as co-conspirators for their roles in blocking Samuel's attempts to report the contamination and in providing Apex with information about his investigation. The web of corruption that Samuel had documented in his journals proved to extend far beyond the local level, and as federal investigators followed the money trails, they uncovered payoffs to state environmental officials, campaign contributions to politicians who'd blocked oversight legislation, and a sophisticated network of shell companies designed to conceal the dumping operations and launder the savings Apex had realized by avoiding proper, toxic waste disposal. Carlos's comprehensive article, published simultaneously in his non-profit news organization and picked up by major newspapers nationwide, transformed Samuel Hartwell from an obscure mountain farmer into a tragic hero, an environmental whistleblower who'd sacrificed everything, including his relationship with his only grandchild, to protect communities that never knew they were in danger. The public response was immediate and overwhelming, with vigils held in Pinewood Ridge and Denver honoring Samuel's memory, and a petition demanding justice for him gathered over 1 million signatures in the first week. The EPA, facing intense public pressure and armed with irrefutable evidence, ordered an immediate comprehensive cleanup of the affected watersheds at Apex Mining's expense, a project estimated to cost over $300 million and take a decade to complete. And they established a mandatory monitoring program that would continue for 50 years to ensure the contamination didn't spread or recur. More significantly, the federal court approved a $200 million settlement fund for the families and communities that had been affected by the contamination, providing compensation for medical expenses, lost livestock, property damage, and establishing long-term health monitoring programs for residents of the downstream areas where cancer rates had mysteriously spiked. Emma found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight as news organizations requested interviews and advocacy groups asked her to speak at environmental rallies, but she declined most requests, giving only one interview to Carlos where she spoke not about her own harrowing ordeal, but about her grandfather's courage and dedication, about the man who'd loved her enough to let her go and who'd spent 15 years alone, fighting a battle most people would have abandoned. The most meaningful moment came 6 weeks after her rescue, when the governor himself traveled to what remained of Samuel's farm and dedicated a memorial at the site, a simple stone marker that read, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, Environmental Scientist and Protector, 1940-2024. He gave everything to save a mountain. His truth could not be buried. Standing before that marker with Ranger at her side and Helen Drummond holding her hand, Emma finally felt the crushing weight of the past months begin to lift, replaced by something that felt almost like peace, the knowledge that her grandfather's sacrifice had not been in vain, and that the legacy he'd left her wasn't just land or evidence, but the understanding that one person's courage, one person's refusal to look away from injustice, could ultimately change everything. The new farmhouse rose from the ashes of the old, like a promise fulfilled, its logs fresh and golden in the autumn sunlight, its windows large and welcoming, its stone chimney built from rocks Emma had gathered herself from the creek bed, where Samuel used to collect his water samples. She'd used the settlement money that came to his estate, money the federal court had awarded for the years of harassment and the ultimate destruction of his property. And she'd hired local contractors who'd known Samuel and wanted to honor his memory by building something that would last another 100 years. The structure was larger than the original, with a proper bedroom, a study where Samuel's rescued journals now lined the shelves, and a wide covered porch that faced the mountains her grandfather had loved and died protecting. Emma stood on that porch on a cool October morning, coffee steaming in her hands, watching Ranger race through the meadow chasing shadows and pure joy, his injuries long healed, his coat glossy with health, his spirit fully restored now that he had a person to protect and land to patrol. He was entirely hers now, the grief that had haunted him transformed into devotion. And she understood that he wasn't just a dog, but a living connection to Samuel, a piece of her grandfather's love, made tangible and loyal and warm. Her truck, a used but reliable vehicle she'd purchased with money from selling her story rights to a documentary filmmaker, sat in the new gravel drive, and in its bed was her backpack filled with textbooks on environmental chemistry, hydrology, and ecological restoration. She'd enrolled at Colorado State University's environmental science program, following in Samuel's academic footsteps, but doing it her way, commuting 3 days a week to Fort Collins for classes, and spending the rest of her time on the farm, studying at the kitchen table Samuel had built with his own hands, the table she'd rescued from the burned farmhouse and refinished with patient love. Her professors, when they learned who she was and what she'd accomplished, had offered her a full scholarship and research opportunities that would have required her to live on campus. But Emma had declined, explaining that she couldn't leave the farm, that this land was more than property, it was family, and they'd understood and accommodated her need to stay rooted in the place that had finally taught her what home meant. Carlos visited regularly, usually bringing groceries and news from the wider world. Whitmore's trial was proceeding. More Apex executives were being charged, and the watershed cleanup was ahead of schedule, with early testing showing dramatic improvements in water quality. He'd become something like a brother to her, and the family she was building one relationship at a time. And they would sit on the porch for hours talking about Samuel's work, about environmental justice, about the stories Carlos was writing that continued to expose corporate environmental crimes across the country. Helen Drummond came by every Sunday with fresh bread and companionship, and Emma had taken to calling her grandmother, though they shared no blood, understanding that family was something you built through love and loyalty, rather than something you were simply born into. The community that had once whispered about the cursed Miller place now treated Emma like a hometown hero, and the general store in Pinewood Ridge had put up a photograph of Samuel with a caption reading, "Local hero, never forgotten." And the elementary school had started an environmental science program in his name. Emma had been invited to speak to the students about her grandfather's work, and she'd stood before 30 children and told them that one person could make a difference. That courage meant doing the right thing, even when it was terrifying, even when you were alone, even when the powerful people said you couldn't win. She told them about a man who'd given up everything, including his only grandchild, to protect water that people miles away would drink without ever knowing his name. And she'd watched understanding dawn in their young faces, watched them grasp that heroism wasn't always dramatic or recognized, but sometimes quiet and persistent and thankless. As the sun climbed higher, and Ranger returned from his morning patrol to flop panting at her feet, Emma thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the orphanage where she'd been nobody's daughter, to this mountain where she'd discovered she was the granddaughter of a hero, from a girl with nothing to a young woman with purpose and land and legacy. She thought about her mother, Sarah, whose photograph now hung above the new fireplace, and about Samuel, whose sacrifice had given her not just property, but identity, not just evidence, but calling. The land stretched out before her in all its recovered beauty, the creek running clear again, the forest green and alive, the mountains standing eternal and protective. And Emma understood with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She wasn't just protecting her inheritance, she was continuing her grandfather's work, studying to become the environmental scientist he'd been, learning to read the land's stories and defend its health, preparing to fight the battles he'd started for the next generation. She had found her home, not in a building, but in a purpose, not in solitude, but in connection to the land and the truth and the courage that ran in her blood. Ranger lifted his head and looked at her with his knowing amber eyes, and Emma knelt to scratch behind his ears this loyal guardian who'd saved her life, and who would spend the rest of his days running free across the mountain his first master had died protecting. She was no longer alone, no longer orphaned, no longer searching for where she belonged, because she'd finally understood that home wasn't a place you found, but a legacy you honored, a fight you inherited, and a love that persisted beyond death. And here on Samuel Hartwell's mountain, surrounded by the evidence of his courage and the beauty he'd preserved, Emma had found all three.